Okay, so good afternoon everyone, and thank you for joining us in this session today, both physically and virtually. My name is Chloe Hill and I am the European Geoscience Union's Policy Officer. I'm also a member of the EuroScience Science Policy Working Group, and I'm very happy to welcome you. I'm also moderating this session today. What versus so what? Science communication in times of crisis. Now, COVID-19 has affected us all in a range of unprecedented ways. It is a human, economic, and social crisis. It is also a cause of misinformation. Now, what is actually causing this misinformation? And how can we, as scientists, science communicators, media representatives, policymakers, and industry leaders, prevent it from spreading? How can we change the question of what, which is very academic, to the more consequential and action-based so what, that interests the public and policymakers? How can we bridge the gap between scientists and policymakers and scientists and the public that still exists? And how can we do this effectively in times of crisis? Now, this is a question that's very challenging and very important that our panellists are going to try to address today. Our panellists, we have 4 of them. One of us is on stage today, Clive. He'll be presenting in person. Our other 3 panellists will be joining us virtually. So it is a hybrid panel. Each panellist will talk for about 10 minutes and then we'll get into a discussion. Now, during this discussion, we will be taking questions from the audience. If you are joining us virtually, please feel free to type your questions into the question box. I believe it will be a little bubble that you can see. We won't be taking breaks for questions between the speakers. We'll get to that afterwards. But please, as soon as you have a question, if you are joining us virtually, type that into the question box. For those of you in the physical audience, we will be doing it the old-fashioned way, so you can raise your hand. But yeah, we'll get to that in the second half of the session today. Now, the speakers that will be joining us are fabulous, and I'm going to introduce them to you now. Our first speaker is sitting with me today on the stage, is Clive Cookson. Clive is a science editor of the Financial Times, where he leads a writing team covering science and technology. He has worked in science journalism since leaving Oxford University with a first-class honours degree in chemistry in 1974. Clive joined the Times in 1981 as a technology correspondent. In 1983, he moved to the BBC Radio as a science and medical correspondent before joining the Financial Times and becoming a science editor in 1991. More recently, yesterday in fact, Clive received the EuroScience Lifetime Achievement Award. And during his presentation today, he'll be giving a very personal view of what it has been like covering COVID-19 for the last 6 months. Our second speaker is Frederica Bresson, who is joining us virtually. She is a Fulbright Scholar and Marie Curie alumna. She holds a PhD in computer science and 2 MDs in music and musicology. She was appointed a Professor of Digital Humanities at the University of Nova Gosha in Slovenia and is currently developing a new line of research that combines technology, cultural studies, product design, and communication. Frederica also produces and hosts the podcast Technoculture, which some of you may have listened to before. During her talk today, Frederica will be talking about the science's current reputation and why we need to scale down our expectations of what science can do. A little bit controversial, maybe. Our third speaker, Svetla Tenova-Enska, is the coordinator of European Parliament's European Science Media Hub. Before starting this role, she worked in the Commission's Directorate General for Communication for 10 years. Svetla has a background in journalism and has worked as a foreign correspondent for the Bulgarian National Television in both Berlin and in Vienna. Today, Svetla will be talking about the European Science Media Hub's role at the interface between policy and research and media. She will also be highlighting the importance of communicating science evidence and the challenge of the infodemic. Our final speaker today, Ivana Kurikek, is a doctoral student in quantum information and an experienced science communicator. She specialises in science and technology policy. Ivana is currently finishing both a PhD and a master's program in politics and technology, co-leading the EuroScience Science Policy Working Group, acting as a planetarium presenter of the ESO Supernova, maintaining freelance engagements as a technical communicator, and working as a freelance consultant. During her talk today, Ivana will be highlighting the impact COVID-19 is having on early career researchers and their interactions with the media, public, and policymakers. So as you can see, we do have a really great panel, a very diverse panel in the different things they're going to be talking about. I think it will raise a lot of questions, so like I said, please feel free to ask questions during this discussion period. And without further ado, I'm going to turn to our first speaker, so Clive.
Thank you very much, Chloe. Well, as you will have gathered from my Lifetime Achievement Award, for which many thanks EuroScience, and from the timeline you read out, it has been a long career, but nothing at all like this has occurred in my experience. This is much the most intense period in my working life, without exception. Working almost entirely from home. I've only been into the FT office 2 or 3 times since the beginning of March. And before I sort of go on any further, I do think it's almost a miracle that not only the FT, but almost every other global newspaper, while putting a lot online, was able to send almost its entire staff home, and still the print editions came out perfectly. We didn't lose anything. All the pages were still laid out well. There were virtually no rehearsals when we were told in the middle of March that, or I can't remember the exact date, something like the 8th or 10th of March, we should go and try working at home for a few days. Everyone thought they'd be back. They didn't quite realize they wouldn't be back until in August. So I think the newspaper industry has done amazingly, collectively, to keep operating. Of course, you could say the whole same thing of banks and insurance companies and call centers, but I think it is pretty fantastic. Also, television and radio programming without interruption has continued. So, COVID, since I went to work from home, long days. So I worked far longer than I ever did, even counting the 45-minute commute each way to the office, sort of start at 7:30 in the morning, maybe 8 o'clock, read what's going on, and often working 12 hours with just the shortest lunch break for a sandwich or something. The demands are intense, and not just on me, but on all my colleagues. And it's not just writing things. In my case, it's advising other editors. They'll email or WhatsApp or call up and say, is this a story, Clive? I know you don't have the capacity to do it, but should we get someone else to do it? Should we care about this, that, and the other vaccine development? When the first vaccines went into people, we cared a lot. But now, when there are sort of 36 in various stages of clinical trial, I have to say, you may have got an excited press release from the company, but no, in the grand scheme, we don't care any longer. We're delighted that it's out there, but we'll wait till it's produced some results. And even then, if they're phase 1 results, rather like other vaccines, we might not be too bothered. It so has skewed our coverage, though, because I have to say that I did a count, and I've written about 150 articles myself about COVID since March, and I've only done 5 on any other aspect of science. And since I'm the only science, sort of general science writer the FT has, it means that all the other areas of science that I would have written about, from sort of super colliding massive black holes to fascinating discoveries about human origins, for example. There have been so many papers that I would normally have covered. Now, I know that this is a fallout of science for scientists in general, and a lot of scientists have moved temporarily to doing other things. But I think it's a great pity, and in general, so much other medical news hasn't been covered. ASCO, for example, the biggest annual cancer conference. It's a huge event for medical journalists normally. This year, not because there was less news, it got very little coverage, because anyone who writes about health and medicine was writing about COVID. Another point I would make is that the PR industry, public relations industry, has really latched on to COVID in a big way, which is their job. But I always used to complain before this that I got far too many email press releases. But I would always say to PRs, please keep sending them, because I can always just delete them. I don't want to miss something that could be important. Well, the volume of press releases has gone up as well. Anyone with any sort of thought about anything to do with COVID, however thin the research, will send out a release. Again, it's their job, but it just is quite wearying. And as you know, one of the things that's happened is that because scientists in all fields have switched to COVID research, there's been a bombardment of scientific papers on the subject. And I found it hard actually to get a really good total for the number, if you count all the ones that are on preprint servers, bioRxiv, medRxiv, etc. But I mean, a couple of months ago, it was said to be 40,000. Anyway, it's way into the sort of high tens of thousands. And journalists have started covering them in a way that, until the end of last year, it was a sort of almost a mantra of sort of responsible science journalists. You wait until a paper has had some sort of peer review. Well, no longer. I mean, it's still nice if peer-reviewed paper, and it can be a bit confusing, because if a paper appears on a preprint server and gets some publicity, the university or research institute will try to get a second bite when it appears in the journal, and you often have to do quite a lot of checking to see whether this is really new, and they kept it quiet until it was properly published in a journal, whether actually it was virtually the same information, maybe adjusted a bit, has already appeared that. So how do we cope with this? Well, the answer has to be, to some extent, doing our own peer review. I mean, you just need to have a good network of contacts and colleagues in universities whom you can ask. And you have to bear in mind that people who know about what's going on in the various aspects of virology, immunology, vaccinology, etc., they're incredibly busy people. And I have been very struck by the way a substantial number of these busy scientists at the heart of COVID research are willing to talk to journalists. Not all, but a surprisingly and gratifyingly large number. I think my time's almost up, but I just want to say one last thing in terms of my coverage, or coverage of science journalists in the UK in general, which is that the Science Media Centre in London, which was set up, I think, 17 years ago, and is now an independent charity, but housed within the Wellcome Trust. It has done a marvellous job putting out, they've got an excellent list of experts, and when anything significant comes up about COVID in the news, any paper that's likely to be covered, or new statistics for test and trace, for infection rates, for the R number, etc. They'll put out a quick reaction press release, giving reactions from scientists on their list. And they also put on several online briefings per week if something new comes up. So I want to close by saying, well done, Science Media Centre.
Very good. Thanks so much, Clive. I think you've raised a couple of really interesting points there that actually I probably hadn't considered before, like the fact that so many breaking news stories might be going under the radar because of COVID-19. And I think our last speaker, Ivan, is going to pick up on the preprint issue as well. So thanks so much. So I'm going to turn straight to our second speaker, Frederica, who will be joining us virtually. And again, if you have any questions for any of the speakers, please just feel free to put them in the Q&A box down below if you're joining us virtually. Okay, so.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
You do?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on the panel today. It's a pleasure to share the stage with brilliant colleagues and an honor to follow Mr. Cookson, whom I congratulate for the important award he's received yesterday. What I want to talk about today is a misunderstanding between science and society that pervades all media communication. Just like all of you, I am currently concerned about the ongoing pandemic. So I watch the news, I try to stay informed, and I pick up clues that, to me, reveal this misunderstanding between science and society. A misunderstanding that is not obvious, that is hidden between the lines. And why it matters is because this misunderstanding does not help the conversation, does not help us move forward. Some examples. About a month ago, I was watching CNN on YouTube, and I stumbled on a few clips that were good examples of what I'm talking about. The clips are all about COVID-19, but I think that we have seen this misunderstanding before, and we'll see it again. So I think that COVID-19 is just what we live through now. What is this misunderstanding exactly? Well, better people than I have tried to elaborate this idea in more than 10 minutes, but here's my condensed version. Science does not tell you what to do. Science does not tell you how to behave in the world. Science is about learning what the universe is made of, and that's why facts are so central in science. Science is about the what. It's objective. But we, as humans, we look at the world as a stage for action. Things are not neutral to us. They are a potential tool or a threat, and we scan the environment in an instrumental way. So we are purpose-driven, and we need to know what to do. This is not the question what. That's beyond the question what. It's so what. Science is one of the ways in which we produce knowledge that we use to navigate reality. Science is one of the sources of knowledge that inform our lives. Politicians and policymakers should absolutely be informed about the science, but then they need to come up with a plan or policy that considers other factors of social relevance to the point that they might slightly disregard or go against what the science says, or oftentimes just fill the gaps, because science does not tell us everything. There's much we don't know about this virus yet, but politicians cannot wait for us to get there. They need to act now. So they take decisions with incomplete data by definition. Many think that science is the source of truth that we can interrogate like an oracle, and then we will know what to do. So we expect science to give us solutions to questions that require a decision. A big one, should we reopen schools in September? Science informs this decision, but it does not have an answer to the question. Science does not tell us what to do. Politicians and policymakers need to take the responsibility to make a decision, an informed decision, and it will be them who will be held responsible, not science. Science, or rather scientists, have their own responsibilities, but to each their own. Let's not dump the politicians' incompetence on science. Speaking of politicians, the first clip I'm going to show you today was published on the CNN YouTube channel on July 31st. Now, I edited the clips that I'm going to show today slightly because I need to fit my time, but I encourage you to watch them on the CNN YouTube channel because they are available online, of course. So give me, please, a sign if you see here and see this correctly.
This is about science. It's what the doctors tell us that we need to do. It's not what I say so that I can come on a show and say I called for testing.
I hope you saw that. Yeah? Okay. It's a very short clip. Just Nancy Pelosi saying, this is not what I want. This is what science tells us to do. Now, I think that she is speaking in good faith. I don't think of Nancy Pelosi as someone trying to hide away from the responsibility to take a decision for the people. I genuinely think that she does the good thing if she obeys what the scientists say. There might be reasons for this, but bottom line, this is what I hear in this clip. And the point is failing to understand this crucial division of role, differentiation of roles. And just in case if you think I'm nitpicking and that it's ambiguous what she says, yes, it may be, but I still think that this ambiguity points in the direction of my way of reading the situation. And if anything, I say clarity would sound differently in her words. Now, don't get me wrong, there's many people that will use science to hide behind a responsibility they don't want to take, avoiding saying, this is my interpretation. As we all know, data don't speak, so data will never say anything, and data does not suggest. We do. Now, the second clip I'm going to show you is one that I really urge you to watch in its entirety. That would be 5 minutes, and I cut it down to 45 seconds today. You can break down every word of the 5 minutes and write an essay about this video. So, sexy superstar Dr. Anthony Fauci is testifying before Congressman Jim Jordan, who keeps asking him, should we limit the protesting? Does the protesting increase the spread of the virus? The protesting he's talking about is obviously the one that we still see happening in the US now, a month from when the clip dates, because it was published on the CNN YouTube channel on July 31st. Here it is.
Should we limit the protesting?
I'm not in a position to determine what the government can do in a forceful way.
It's a simple question, doctor. Should we limit the protest?
I'm not going to opine on limiting anything. I'm telling you what it is, the danger. And you can make your own conclusion about that.
Do you see the inconsistency, though, Dr. Fauci?
There's no inconsistency, Congressman. I don't understand what you're asking me as a public health official.
I just want an answer to the question. Do the protests increase the spread of the virus?
I don't have any scientific evidence that anything. I can tell you that crowds are known to increase the acquisition and transmission, no matter what.
So you don't have a position on whether the protests increase the spread of the virus or don't increase the spread of the virus?
All right. So you should really watch this clip entirely, because the misunderstanding iterated is phenomenal. For 5 minutes, Jim Jordan keeps insisting on the same question, and Fauci, he says the right things, but I don't think he's doing a good job at defending himself and science, because he represents science there. He even gets to the point of admitting, I don't have scientific evidence of protesting a particular form of public gathering, that it increases the spread of the virus. And that's a defeat in this exchange. He iterates that he cannot tell the government what to do, but Mr. Jordan is deaf to that. He kept grilling him, because I think that he also speaks in good faith out of ignorance, but he does not realize that he's making a fool of himself by asking that question so many times. It's not the wrong question. He's asking the wrong person. Fauci is obstinate in denying the answer, making it seem, though, that he does not want to give the answer, as if he doesn't want to expose himself, like all the I don't recall the positions, because that's standard. And I think that he comes across like those people here. So he says the right things, but they're not enough here because Mr. Jordan does not understand what Fauci means and he is aggressive. So I think that the misunderstanding here is obvious, but that Fauci should have explained the flowers and the bees to Mr. Jordan. So why it's not up to him to have a position on those things. Just before I conclude, I would like to pull up one more slide here with the references to the two clips that I just showed. You can take a screenshot or a picture, I guess. And the reference to my YouTube channel, because I would like to mention that besides my podcast, I have recently been doing other interviews, in particular these three on COVID-19, two of which with the same biomathematician, Mayra Aguiar, and one we just recorded yesterday. So it's not up yet. What is the R number? And I want to keep working on this. So why I show you is not because I think I'm not the BBC, like this is great science communication, but at least if I'm critical of other media, I also expose myself and I talk the talk and walk the walk. So to conclude, I will try to answer a question expressed in the panel summary. How can we ensure that study results are more effectively interpreted and conveyed to the population? Well, my opinion is that it's rarely about the results. It's a misunderstanding of what we expect from science. So the results are correctly presented, but the interviewer or journalist will ask, so what, to a scientist who cannot follow up, provided that it's scientists who should do this type of communication. Maybe we need science communicators as a specific professional figure. In fact, I also take issue with this pressure on researchers and young researchers to communicate their science. But we get the sentiments of frustration for not getting enough answers. And scientists come across as being either incompetent or cowards. And I find that science is vilified for failing to give the answers that we should give, we humans, and not the data. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Federica. I think you did a really good job of not only highlighting the fact that these different roles exist, but that we should actually understand and acknowledge them probably more than we do, not just scientists, but obviously also media and the public as well. And actually following up from that, we do have our third speaker, who is Svetla, and she'll be highlighting the role of the European Science Media Hub. And so this is sort of following on from that policymaker role into the scientists and the media, bring them all together. So Svetla, I will turn straight over to you. Oh, actually, one more thing before I do, sorry. I have got a couple of questions coming in from the people participating virtually, which is fantastic. When you do ask your questions, if you could put your name and affiliation as well, that'd be fantastic so we know who's actually asking these questions. Okay, thanks.
Many thanks, Chloe. I hope you can hear me from Brussels. Thanks a lot for this opportunity to present you our experience in the European Science Media Hub with this really very complex situation and interaction between policymakers, scientists, and media in the pandemic. Very short overview, just because we are quite new project. The European Science Media Hub is based in STOA in the European Parliament. STOA is the panel for the future of science and technology, composed of 27 members of the European Parliament. This is not a legislative body, but the idea is to give the science advice and also the different option assessments to the policymakers and also to bring them in contact with scientists. Our role in the European Science Media Hub was also to bring the policymakers and the researchers closer also to the media. So science journalism, science communication is of course very much on our focus, and we try to develop this network and regular dialogue between the researchers and the media, with science media especially, with also some events, workshops, trainings to facilitate the work of the media and to monitor some media trends about, of course, mainly news around science and new technology. Of course, the pandemic also hit us very strongly, so we had to cancel all our events. But already February, March, we very early actually realized that if we want to remain relevant with basically trying to facilitate the access to trustworthy information, we have to modify our activities. And also that's why we basically devoted all our content on the website to the corona crisis. The idea of our main activities was to share more European expertise in the crisis. That's why we started series of interviews with European researchers, really leading researchers and virologists who advised their respective governments actually. We had more than 10 interviews and they were quite popular. And I think it was also because people could see the different perspective. Sometimes we were too focused on our national public health measures and our national approach, but this could give also some lessons learned from other countries. And this was maybe some colleagues were missing, and that's why they used a lot and republished our interviews. Another point here is, I think it's interesting that we saw in this crisis, especially in the beginning, really increased, Clive actually very well described it, increased demand for information. And even if we saw a lot of misinformation, it was a big demand for really sound science, for a real credible expertise. That's why I would say that in this time, if it was anything positive, I think we have evidence to believe that at least in the time of the first months of the pandemic, we saw really increased trust among citizens to the scientists. And this is also evidence. I can quote some surveys from Open Knowledge Foundation or Wissenschaft im Dialog in Germany, in the UK, the Open Knowledge Foundation, where we have surveys around May, and they really show increase in the trust in scientists and in science compared to the years before. Another problem, also very well described by the science journalist, is that people were just overwhelmed by information. That's why we tried also to channel our information and to channel all these press releases, news we receive from all possible institution, organizations, and also academia, and to present a collection of most relevant links to also, this was very useful for our members of the European Parliament, to channel a little bit the overwhelming amount of information. And these collections of links were very also useful for our readers. We had a collection for good sources of information around COVID-19. We had also a collection with links of different initiatives and organizations dealing with debunking of misinformation and fake news around COVID-19. And also we regularly update our content of the page sciencemediahub.eu. You can visit it and see with relevant information. Here is maybe the moment to tell you that we work with European researchers and with European science writers and science journalists to prepare these interviews and to prepare these articles. So we also try to popularize European research and to facilitate the access to trustworthy information. Infodemic, it was also on our focus. You know that it was quite a worrying spread of false claims, misinformation and disinformation, conspiracy theories. We tried also here to find the experts dealing with this topic, to understand better the phenomena, to understand better how we as a society could tackle this issue, because I'm sure you saw also studies where we see a direct impact of the health of people following some false claims, but this also undermines the public health measures, and we have to be very, very cautious with tackling misinformation. We will continue also with this content dealing with false claims around COVID-19. We will try also to observe with monitoring tools on social media the emerging tendencies around disinformation and misinformation, and to alert, of course, partners, and this is, of course, the work of independent journalists and fact checkers to debunk these misinformations. And we will continue to work also virtually with science journalists, organize workshops, events, trainings for them, in order, once again, to try to help them to get to trustworthy sources of information, and also to raise awareness about the misinformation and disinformation around. So I will stop here, but I'm happy for your questions after this.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Svetla. I think that was a really nice presentation that gave a more positive view, actually, of the increasing trust in scientists and some of the products that have come out, the science communication products that have come out of the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's really fantastic. So I will move on to our final speaker now, Ivana. So just as a reminder, Ivana will be talking about, she'll be talking from a scientist's perspective about the impact COVID-19 is having on early career researchers and their interactions with the media, the public, and with policymakers.
Thank you so much, Chloe. Hi, Izov. Welcome to my home office. Like Chloe announced, I am indeed a scientist, and I will be speaking from a scientist's perspective on the topic of science communication. First of all, like everyone, I have also experienced issues this year because of the current pandemic. I lost a fellowship opportunity abroad, and so have many of my colleagues. So for a lot of us, science communication is definitely not at the top of the list of things we worry about and what we spend our time on. More pressing needs are extending our contracts and moving abroad when that might not be possible anymore due to a lack of visas or simply lack of opportunities as funding gets drawn this year. However, we keep hearing these wonderful stories of scientists sharing their research, like Clive already explained, with the media, with journalists, and with the general public. Why does that happen? And why do we do this? Well, from a sense of duty to society, we all go into science wanting to change the world, wanting to contribute. Unfortunately, it doesn't always pay off. Do SciComm, do science communication. We hear that taught all the time. But the question is when and why? Because when it comes down to it, when I will be looking for my next academic position or thousands of my colleagues, nobody will be asking us, how many outreach projects did you participate in? Or how many things have you shared about your research on Twitter? How many journalists did you talk to? They will be asking us about the funding we obtained, about the papers we published, about the collaborations we did. Unfortunately, that is the reality we are dealing with. So when we are asked to share our research, we first need to consider, and myself personally as well, will this affect my ability to do research as much as I can be doing? Now, when we do talk to the media, one thing that Clive didn't mention, but I know is a big issue for a lot of scientists, is the question of whether we'll be misinterpreted, misquoted. Maybe our quotes will be enhanced for a little bit of a spark inside of a title about a report on something that we did that might not apply to a general situation. And our point of view, like Federica already explained, as a scientist, is very neutral. We are trying to be objective. We are trying to reach a particular result. And unlike policymakers, politicians, and the general public, we are not looking to give prescriptions. We are not looking to give decisions. We are looking to provide information and to explain certain phenomena. This is a large issue, and you can find a lot about this in the research field that deals with trans science. Trans science meaning the problems that, or the questions that are asked of science and of scientists, but which technically cannot be answered by scientists. So if you ask somebody, should we disallow protests at times of corona? We should not be the people to answer this. And not only because we might not be able to, but because engaging in these kinds of discussions, as we have seen with a large number of scientists this year, may affect our research careers. After all, when we do get hired, the institutions hiring us do not want any bad press. They do not want to risk their reputation with researchers who may be vocal on the political scene. Unfortunately, this is the reason why we tend to, as a group, stay away from controversial or highly politicized topics. It may, in fact, affect our careers. So for one, we frankly don't have the time for this if we don't communicate. When we do, we are risking our reputation as scientists in our field. And yet, we have seen so many people, mostly early career researchers, so PhD students and postdocs, similar in age to myself, who switched their fields of research this year for at least 6 months to the research of COVID-19 and its effects. Okay, this was a very needed move. We are in a time of crisis, as the title of this panel says, but at the same time, these 6 months in the careers of these researchers will not positively affect their personal future. I am in the field of theoretical physics, and my colleagues switched to social dynamics for 6 months to see the effects of the virus. These are truly not simple decisions to make. So I want to quickly touch upon what the previous speakers have discussed and tell you what a scientist or somebody from the perspective of an early career researcher has to say about the troubles we have dealing with these topics. First of all, Clive gave us a wonderful insight into how difficult it's been to deal with all the news and all the new papers, especially on preprint servers. However, in times of crisis, this is how we react. We jump on a problem and we try to solve it. As everybody is aware, scientists don't do science for monetary reward. We want to help, we want to change the world, we want to do good. So when there's a problem, we approach it. However, with the giant amount of research that's being done and flooding the preprint servers, it sometimes is really difficult to understand what is truly valuable and important. On the other hand, if we go through the traditional route of classical publishing, waiting for a peer review and the due process that comes with it might take a few weeks, or it might take a few months, or it might just take a year or two, depending on the field that we're in. So when there is a time of crisis, we should strive for openness, for transparency. And this is also what Svetla was talking about, with the increased trust the general public has been giving to scientists who have recently been showing so much transparency and openness. This is the reflection of the spirit of democracy, where we truly appreciate getting a better insight into topics that might not be shared otherwise. So when it comes to Svetla's contribution, I really see the importance and relevance of the center that she is representing. And at the same time, I worry that the pressure on scientists, and especially early career researchers who do have the potential and potentially the time to engage in science communication, might actually hurt their careers and might hurt their reputations. It might put them in a position where it is difficult to pull back and say, hey, I'm only doing science. Please don't ask me to give my comments on the political state of my country. On the other hand, there are also so many of us, especially those in the first decade or so of their careers, who are not working in a country where they speak the local language. So even if we do want to share our science, our results, if we do want to do science communication in an effective and meaningful way, we don't have that many opportunities. And reaching policymakers can also get really difficult. It turns out that you really don't have much of a say as a young scientist. You need to have developed network at your place of employment and life. You need to be able to reach a larger audience than you might have available. So these are definitely issues that we are facing. And at the same time, we are living in the society that has these problems we are trying to solve. Federica was talking a lot about the management of risk and trying to separate science from the application of science. In a way, scientific results are often used as a sort of justification for certain policy decisions. This is okay. This is what we should be doing, but we should not be asking scientists themselves to, on top of their own work, put out the time to make these decisions. There's a wonderful way of going around this, which Svetla definitely has experience in, which are these transitional intermediary organizations that help, Kai was also talking about this, that help distill the knowledge that scientists have to share, the results of research, and translate them to policymakers, translate them to the general public, and make them into something tangible and something useful. So in conclusion, what I do have to say from my personal perspective as a PhD, as a finishing PhD student who has done a fair bit of science communicating, so far it's a struggle. We are being told, yes, communicate. We are being told, yes, jump on this topic. It's a crisis. We need your help. But at the same time, it is not paying off for us. It is a very altruistic act, but it is hurting the careers of early career researchers at this point. And most of them, unfortunately, will not see the impact of their work in any larger extent. So I'm really looking forward to discussing these topics with you and seeing what kind of insights you might want to share with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ivana. Okay, so there's so many questions in there. I think that's such a great point to jump into our discussion from. I also have my own questions, but I'm gonna start with one of Ivana's sort of first questions. I think there's a lot in there that was addressed to Clive, and that was more about what can journalists or scientists do to ensure that the scientist or the science they are covering is correctly represented, and the scientist isn't misquoted. Is there something the scientist can do? Is there something the journalist can do? Yeah.
You do have to know which journalists you can trust, and obviously if you're a young researcher, that's going to be harder because you won't have the experience, you won't have the knowledge. I mean, I talked about the importance for journalists of internal peer review, but for scientists who've been around for a while, they can do their own internal review of journalists and know who is reliable, who they can trust, and who they can't. If you're a young researcher starting out, it is much, much harder. You can't guarantee that you won't be misquoted. I can say, hand on heart, no one in my entire career has accused me of misquoting. I often change quotes to make them more lucid or better, and sometimes a scientist will say, thank you, I sound better than I actually was. One thing that I used to be asked more than I am now is, can you ask the journalist as a scientist to check quotes or read back parts of the story? And the short answer is you can try, but if you do, you have to say ask at the beginning. If you ask at the end of the interview, the journalist has every right to say you should have said that at the beginning, then I could have decided whether to do the interview. So that's point number one. Point number two, on the Financial Times, because we originate as a business newspaper, and in the past, editors have been concerned about people trying to manipulate stock market sensitive information. We are not allowed to read back anything to our sources in case they try to manipulate it. I myself will if I'm not certain about it, but then there's also a time constraint. If I can talk to a scientist who wants to have his or her quotes checked or read back, and another who doesn't, then I'll obviously talk to the one who doesn't, because I'm under time pressure. I hope that answers your question to an extent.
Yeah, I think it was a good answer. I will just say, I don't know, maybe we can get like a discussion screen view going, because I think, yeah, perfect, thank you. Because all of the questions that are being asked, we do have like a range of different expertise inside of each and every panelist. So if you want to jump in and respond to someone else who has answered a question, absolutely feel free. And for those of you in the audience, I think there's a microphone at the back in which you can ask questions. Is that correct? That microphone is where these people here should ask questions? Yes, yes. So if you do have a question, for those of you who are sitting in front of me, if you could just go up to the microphone just at the back there, and you can ask your questions from there. Yeah, exactly. I will come to you if you do that. And once again, for everyone who's listening virtually, just type your questions into the box. So I do have a couple of other questions that sort of came up during the discussion that I will just get to first, and then I'll get to the ones that we've already been asked virtually on our discussion board. And once again, all of the panelists feel free to jump in on this, but this one is more specifically to Frederica, who highlighted the difficulty that the scientists have with communicating the so what of their science, and highlighting the need for policymakers to take on this role. My question is more, in your opinion, what is needed for the policymakers to take on this role? Is it an issue that the policymakers don't realise that this is their role, or maybe they don't know the what of the science? Yeah, I'll let you take that one.
Thank you. Well, the reality of this situation is so very complex, right? So when we say policymakers, who are they? When we say scientists, who are they? So the reality is very complex. I don't know, sometimes when, like Ivana said, someone justifies decisions with science, that can be done in good faith or bad faith. So I would start by saying that goodwill is nice to always be expected there. That would be the beginning of solving a misunderstanding, because the situation offers itself to be manipulated like that. How to change, how to make sure that science is better communicated probably has also to do with the roles that each one have, because we're still talking about scientists and the public and policymakers. And like I said, there should be the science communicators, and the scientists should be left alone to do their job. That's what I think. Sometimes we have those figures, sometimes not. It's a very complex system. I'm a researcher. I used to be full-time, and I'm transitioning to science communication. I'm definitely in a gray zone, and I resonated with a lot that Ivana said. It does not pay off at all. There is no way to ensure that science is well communicated. And one of the most important things is to educate the public, but that is like life, like not a $1 million question. That's like the goal of being a better society, to have the audience be critical, to have the audience precisely know exactly what science is saying and not be confused why we were told to wear masks first, not to wear masks then, to wear them outside, indoors, downtown. That confusion is not to be blamed on science, but I don't have an easy answer on how to solve that, besides honesty from the part of those who speak and education from the parts of those who listen or receive the message. I would have a question for Clive if you're happy with what I said and
Yeah.
can do that.
Absolutely. I might just quickly turn to Svetla to see if she has
Yeah.
anything to say on that issue, and then I'll come back to you.
Many thanks, Chloe, Federica. It was really very interesting, the points you mentioned, and it is very coming very close to that what we in the European institutions we call science advice for policy. And if in our project we are not dealing with exactly with this, in the panel for the science and technology is exactly in the heart of this issue, how we can have real and best advice as you as scientists to the policymakers. And there are a lot of colleagues in the European Commission Joint Research Center or in SAPEA, where we have the really European high level academies giving science advice to policy. And they have really very good documents. I can only encourage you to see and to check them, like recommendations for scientists. What is the best in order to translate their science to the policymakers. And I think that this is also something what we do, for example, in STOA, is also very useful. We have the so-called pairing scheme. So this is a kind that for 2-3 days, scientists really accompany the politicians, the members of the European Parliament in but really long period. We don't speak about 10 minutes meetings. We really speak of about 3-4 days. The scientists visit the European Parliament. They go with the members of the European Parliament to the committees, to the political groups, and see how they work. So they understand better the demand of the politicians for science information. On the other side, the politicians, of course, understand also better the methodology, and also the needs and struggle of the scientists in this process. So I think, again, as you said, more education, more contacts, more dialogue between scientists and policymakers is very, very important. And we have also some good examples, actually, during the crisis, where we saw scientists communicating to the general citizens, to the general audience. I have one example from a country where I'm following because of the language. Maybe you know also one of the best virologists in Germany, Christian Drosten, who had a podcast 30 minutes every day. I think it was downloaded 60 million times. And he really took the time. So we have to take the time. As Clive said, sometimes it's the time pressure. But for this level of communication, we have to take the time and to explain the context also to the citizens. They're able to understand the scientific method. They are able to understand the difference between scientists and their information, and that they're not giving the prescriptions, but they're only giving the facts, and the difference between the policymakers who actually has to take the decision. But we have really to take a little bit more time and indeed to work better together.
Yeah. Okay, so a couple of great answers there. It does sort of lead on to Ivana's question about the incentives for scientists to get engaged in those activities, which, you know, obviously highly beneficial for society, but also for the scientists, it depends on their motivations too. And I do want to get to that question, but first, I know that Federica had a question, and we do have one question from the audience here as well. So I'll go Federica first, audience, and then back to that question.
Thank you. A question for Clive. He says that he has been interfacing with scientists all his career, and indeed, when there's something, a hot topic going on, you will read on the newspapers here in Belgium the opinion of some big professor in that area. It's never the young postdoc, it's the big professor. So actually, journalists need to have someone to speak to. In your, not more than experience, in your opinion, who should those scientists be? Should there not be scientists, and specifically science communicators? When the journalist picks up the phone, does he already have the full professor's number, or should the journalist Google the PhD students of that department, who you think should be doing the communication specifically from the lab to the media, to the newspaper office?
That's such an interesting question, and since in the last few minutes I've been thinking about that, and I've come to the conclusion that the result of the corona crisis is that far more professors and senior scientists and men have been quoted in the media than last year. For example, if there's an interesting research paper and you're writing about it as a journalist, I will normally try to speak to the first author, who is usually the young scientist, if it's some new piece of research. But if in the sort of pell-mell of COVID-19, it's totally different, because it's not so much, you may be talking about a research paper, but quite often what you're talking about is what the science says. And I think this absolutely fascinating point you made about the disconnect. So you're talking to professors about what the science says, and this is what the editors want to know. What is the evidence for transmission of COVID-19 in schools? How does the transmission of the virus between the children interact with the transmission of the virus into wider society? And there, although there may be studies, you're really asking for sort of scientific opinions. So, I mean, to go back to your original question, I think it's really sad that I've talked to far larger number of scientists this year, but a smaller proportion of them have been young scientists with interesting research projects, because last year I wrote about a lot of things that just took my fancy. They were interesting studies about this, that, and the other thing, which this year I've not been able to do. So there's been a very interesting change, and I'm glad you've made me think about it. I'm not sure quite what we can do, but it's there.
Yeah, I think this session might raise more questions than it answers, unfortunately, but definitely a good answer. I saw Ivana also had her hand up to that question too. Did you want to say something, Ivana?
Yeah, I just wanted to contribute with what I find to be the solution to this is having a brilliant press officer at a research institution who will allow younger scientists or scientists who may have more interesting things to say about a topic to talk to journalists, to talk to the media, instead of it always being the head of the department, the head of the institute, who may not have had their hands in this particular research project. I've found really brilliant results for this when there is an institution that has a wonderful press officer. I don't know if this has been your experience, Clive, but I truly hope so.
It so makes a difference. I totally agree, Ivana. It makes a gigantic difference. I think university press officers vary a lot, but the general standard has been going up, I think, quite fast. So I am encouraged, yes. I also should say in passing, I mean, we were talking about why the science communication is not recognized, particularly by younger researchers. Well, that's really up to university administrations, research councils, funding organizations. And a lot of them say they do. A lot of them say that they take account of public engagement and communications as one of the sort of impact factors that they take account of. But you're saying in practice that doesn't happen.
What I'm saying is that yes, they will count every single thing you've done, but when it comes to the point where you're applying for your next, let's say, postdoc, you will list those, but realistically, will any hiring committee look at your teaching credentials? Will they look at your outreach engagements, or will they look at the grants, the publications, and the reputation that you can bring them? Unfortunately, we're still at the stage where this is not a crucial element to the hiring process. And if you want to play the game and have a career in academia, you need to play to the factors that are relevant, unfortunately.
Yes.
Yeah, actually that leads to, I haven't forgotten about the person in the audience and the questions in front of me, but that does lead directly into the question, what can we do to incentivize science communication? Is it really, do we have to change the institutionalized hiring process, or are there other ways we can potentially do this? Anyone? To everyone on the panel.
Well, should we?
Ooh, more questions than we have answers.
How do you mean,
That's a great
Federica?
question, Federica. Because the points that you were making and that I do agree with is that scientists should not necessarily have the role of also communicating their science on top of all the work that they do. Some may be good at it, some may want to do it, but that should not be the primary job of a scientist. The crucial solution here might be having a person who can act as a sort of translator, as I take this, I put it there, and these are usually in the functions of policymakers. So maybe Svetla can tell us a little bit more about what is the future of this topic.
I'm afraid I cannot give any prognosis, but I agree that it is absolutely important that it pays off. If you have these efforts in your career as a young researcher, it should make, of course, sense. And I also agree with you, Federica, that this is not on all price. I mean, if you're good at this, you can do it. If you think that you can communicate better than a professional communicator, you can do it, but it shouldn't be a must in part of your career if you prefer to, of course, to put the accent on your research, for example. And I think here, again, a lot of dialogue is needed between the I'm very happy that we have the scientists and the journalists here, because we see this also in our events. This is so important to understand where are the struggling points for you as a scientist, and where is the on the other side of the journalist, and just to overcome this mistrust we see sometimes. Okay, we know the scientists, they cannot communicate, and the journalists, they cannot get actually the science never right. So I think, again, the dialogue is the answer.
Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn to the person in our audience who has a question. If you can just go up to the microphone, that would be great. And then all of the panelists should be able to hear it, I think.
Okay, so I would like, up to here, it seems that you have been talking about sort of good science, good scientists, and good faith. Clive mentioned the fact that there might be issues of conflict of interest, but sort of on the side. But I will speak as a Frenchman. We've been confronted with a fantastic science communicator, scientist, Didier Raoult, the hydroxy, how do you say it, chloroquine guy in Marseille. I mean, he has all the credentials you can imagine. He has huge number of papers, very high citation index. So for any journalist, he's a serious person. The fact is that either he is a crook or he is crazy. He's been tremendously, I mean, he has played a tremendously awful role in France in the discussion about COVID-19. Now there's, you know, he's the star, the hero of a number of people who are anti-establishment and anti-science. But on the other hand, he presents himself as, you know, a top scientist. And in fact, if you read, you know, it seems like this. So how can you tell? How can a journalist tell that this person who seems to be a fantastic scientist is a crook and that this other person is reliable?
The answer is to ask other scientists. And I think there were enough other scientists willing to diss a professor, a distinguished elderly professor like Professor Didier Raoult. So I think it may have taken a while, but I think he has been discredited by other scientists, whereas there are other figures who, on the whole, have been supported by other scientists. Obviously, Tony Fauci is a good example. In that clip, he may not have performed as well as Federica thought he should have, but he has been so supported by other scientists. So I think, for a journalist, yes, we do look at people's credentials. If they've had a distinguished career and are a professor or have been a professor at a top hospital or university, of course that matters. I don't know if anyone else thinks about this.
I can tell you right away that one of the most brilliant things that I find with the slow but steady switch of scientific publishing to preprints is that they're accessible to a large number of scientists. Suddenly we're discussing everything because we can read everything really quickly. If you go to Twitter and you search for a particular topic, you will see so many scientists, experts in a particular field, discussing the newest papers. I think the switch to more transparent science, more maybe fast, better communication between scientists is going to be the thing to lead to the definitive way of knowing whether it's something is accepted by the scientific community or not, which does equal to whether we as scientists think it's correct or cuckoo.
And a related point, sorry, I don't want to monopolize the conversation, is that when papers about COVID reach the journals, almost all the main journals have made them automatically open access. And that has given a level of transparency to research in this field that no field of research has had in the era of modern scientific publishing. And I think that's been good.
Yeah, okay. So on that note, I think we have 18 minutes left, and I'm going to start to get to the virtual questions now. So sorry for everyone who's listening virtually, who's waiting for their question to be read out. Paige from England asks, do you have any advice on how to improve communication of science to parts of society that are harder to reach, i.e. those with little interest in science that do not describe to news channels, etc.? So I think that's an important question. I think on top of that, maybe people who, that's one question. I think another part of the question could be, how do you reach those who might already distrust science or believe in conspiracy theories? So I think there's two sides to that coin that I think everyone on our panel might have an opinion about. So whoever would like to start may
Well,
speak.
I would like maybe to say something about the question, besides saying in response to Clive, I hope it didn't come across like I was criticizing Fauci as a scientist, because I was not. It was painful to watch that exchange. About this question, I think that we are talking about science communication, and we have for the past half hour. The panel was about in a time of crisis. So reaching an audience that normally does not follow science or these people, that's special in a time of crisis, because those people might wake up and actually listen for the first time. So I would like to just flavor the question with this aspect.
Yeah.
And I would let someone else go first.
So Svetla? Yeah.
Yes, I agree, Federica. Actually, in time of crisis, everybody was interested in all pandemic issues. And about people who we actually, it is really difficult to get people who are more attentive to conspiracy theories or misinformation, disinformation. This is really a very high risk here. Again, back to the research, if we read some of the scientific evidence, you see that it is very difficult to get to the hardcore, really believers in conspiracy theories or misinformation or anti-vax, people who really identify themselves with this conspiracy theory. Is almost impossible to get them with the real facts. But there is a lot of potential to get to people who just listen from time to time, are interested in this. And here we really have to be very active, everybody, not only policymakers and the European institutions, but of course, this is whole society topic and issue and task, media, scientists. Actually, as an individual also, everybody should react. If you see on social media, and 88% from all this misinformation are usually via social media, we have to react, not necessarily to overwhelm with science-based information, but just to react and say this is not true, because like this we can prevent other people to like it, to share it, and this prevention is sometimes more important than to run after fake news which are already viral, for example, on the social media.
Okay, great. Anyone else want to add to that? No? Okay, great. Then I'm going to get to the next question, because we do have quite a few coming in. Okay, so Anonymous asks, has the COVID-19 pandemic changed any of your views about how science should be communicated to the public?
Well, what Clive said about it being open and accessible to the general public, that's been brilliant. Suddenly everybody not only knew what was going on from the news, but developed an interest in science and scientific research. So like Federica said, this might be not a crisis for science communication, but an opportunity. And we might be able to learn something from it.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Does anyone else have anything to contribute? Okay, we do have quite a few questions coming in, so I'm going to go to the next one. While this is also from Anonymous, while the data alone cannot provide a solution, especially in these times, the role of social scientists was not mentioned by Federica. What role, therefore, should social scientists, researchers, and other stakeholders play in times of crisis? So,
I guess
yes.
I have to respond.
Yes.
That's my point. They should have a role. All these people, yes, that's just like the bottom of the cake, the top of the cake. We need all that stuffing in the middle. That's all those people, exactly. I say yes. Is that an answer?
Sure. Does anyone else have anything to contribute?
Well, I completely agree. And I think social scientists, there's been quite a lot of criticism in the UK that the official government science advisory bodies have not paid enough attention to social scientists or behavioral scientists. And I think that's registered with journalists, and there is an improvement in the inclusion of social scientists who obviously have a great deal to say about this crisis. So I agree.
Yeah, great. Okay, this one is actually also for you, Clive. It says, thank you and congratulations for your talk, from Anonymous. He's wondering how you balance your time and demands to write the 150 COVID-19 articles and scanning preprints, journals properly, to ensure the information you're using is actually useful. So I guess this has two components. One, how are you managing your work-life balance? Is everything okay, maybe? And I guess that again goes to, how do we ensure that the breaking newsworthy stories that aren't COVID-19 relating to other areas of science are actually being covered by the media?
Well, it is, I think, one answer to the question of how you cover so much is that while maintaining accuracy, as a journalist, I have to pay less attention to the style. I've always prided myself on sort of writing nice prose and thinking of a nice sort of lead-in, nice introduction to the article. Well, you don't have time now. You just, as long as it's accurate and right, the sort of the writing style is less important. And I think I've noticed that. I mean, there are people who do have a great writing style. In this field, probably Ed Yong is the exemplar. He writes beautifully long feature articles. But then he is doing feature articles every few days. He's not sort of doing news stories under pressure. So I think that's the best I can do for an answer, really. Not worry too much about how well it's written, as long as it's clear and accurate. And don't try to spend time, as I used to sometimes, thinking of a really elegant phrase to sum up something. Maybe there isn't one.
Yeah, yeah. Fair enough. Okay, so we do just have under 10 minutes left. I'm going to ask this question actually from me, because we do have quite a lot of EuroScience board members in the room today. What do you think intermediary organisations like EuroScience, who work at the interface of all of these different sectors, science, policy, media, can do to translate research or maybe facilitate science communication? Is there something that broader organisations can do? Is it possible given limited resources? I'm also asking this from my perspective too, as someone who is working at a similar organisation. What can we do to help scientists, to help policymakers, to help those in the media get this science in times of crisis as well as regular times as well?
Well, I want to say that EuroScience is doing it. Not what can we do, it's doing it.
Good. Got some smiles, I think.
On many fronts, but that's for the short answer is that.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Maybe Svetla, do you happen to work with any other organisations that have scientists that are members or anything in that regard? Does that help you out with your work?
Exactly. We work, of course, also with EuroScience and with many other institutions, and also with the European institutions. I think, once again, we can be this platform for dialogue. We can facilitate this dialogue between the media, researchers, and the policymakers, bring them closer, trying to explain them the different supply and demand between scientists and researchers. That's why networking is quite trivial, but it is actually key and dialogue for this exactly for these organizations at the interface between the actors.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. We do have one more question from the audience. Did you? Yeah. Great. And this might actually have to be our last question. So.
Well, I actually have two.
Oh, okay.
But try to be very brief. So the first question is for Clive. You spoke about flow of information. This is actually also happens in regular times. Sometimes scientists, they can't be updated in their own niche. That's really exploded during the COVID. So you as a journalist, so as a non-expert person, which are the strategies that do you enforce to find and select the good and the proper story, so something that is scientifically relevant and it also relevant for the society? Do I straightly go also for the second, or I just wait?
Why don't you ask the second, because it may relate to the first.
Okay, so the second question is for Federica. So you showed us that painful moment with Dr. Fauci. So something happened also in Italy, where politicians were just deflecting the pressure to scientists. What a scientist or the scientific community can do in order to avoid that without making it look as a defeat?
Okay, shall I answer the first question to give you some time to think? That's a great question. You're pulled two ways in an area like this, and more generally. One is you can't just go off on your own because your editors, your readers will expect you to reflect what other people are writing, reading about, hearing on television or seeing on social media. So you can't just go off on your own. You can't, that's why journalists have something of a herd mentality. I mean, if there's some big story about a sort of vaccine trial or some person, some important person who's broken the lockdown rules, you can't just ignore it if everyone else is covering it. But at the same, so I have to do that, but I also need to have some things that are really my own. And what do I choose? I choose to cover things that are quite hard to explain, which I think are really important. For example, before I came here, I've been doing a lot, which hasn't yet been published, on really getting to the mysteries of the human immune system, how that interacts with the virus, and in particular, what we can learn from the sort of animal origins, the bats, and how the bat immune system deals with these viruses, which infect the bats but don't really make them ill. So it's a question of just following the herd, but also taking time to do your own thing. Sorry, it's not a very precise answer, but I think it's the best I can do. And now it's over to you, Federica.
Did I understand the question correctly? What can the scientists do to prevent this guilt to be dumped on them?
Yes.
Huh. Isn't it a lost battle somehow? What I feel oftentimes, it's not a moment. It's all a process. It's domino effect. Communication is not so good all along, and then at some point, one scientist will receive very bad reviews on a newspaper. So what I wish I saw is way more often people having the courage to stand up for themselves or science, or honesty, speaking the truth. I don't see enough of that, including from these healthcare officials very close to the President of the United States that did not stand up when he was saying that very incorrect things during the press release. Courageous people. Because for the scientist, when he is at the end of this chain of misunderstandings, I don't think that there's almost anything he or she can do to prevent that or convince everyone else that it wasn't his fault or her fault. Brave people. I have so many things to say that could end my career in research and communication at any moment. I don't know if that will happen, but I do try to to speak the truth, not to say uncomfortable things. That's not my goal, but to speak the truth. I said a couple today, for example.
It's also quite similar to what Ivana was talking about earlier. Ivana, do you have anything to add to that?
I think Federica summed it up really nicely. These are definitely concerns that any scientist has. If you speak up, you're going down the rabbit hole, and there's really no turning back. You're exposing yourself to public critique, whether that is something you're expecting or not. And at the same time, different researchers in different fields of research. We have social scientists, we have economists versus epidemiologists. They're going to have different views of what is important in a crisis situation such as this one. So it's a dangerous move, and you need to be aware of what you're doing when you're taking it.
Yeah, nice and short, which is good because we have less than 2 minutes left. So I'll just give a couple of sort of final words, basically summarizing this session, which has covered a huge amount of content in just an hour and a half. I think it was the nature of the session. We did hear about some positive things that have come out of the crisis. So things like a greater trust in science, that's fantastic. Some initiatives that really counter the dis and misinformation coming from the European Union, that's really good to hear as well. But of course, there's the negative impacts as well, the potential to miss breaking news or stories that feature science other than COVID, and also the increased workload which sort of is pushed onto scientists, onto the media, onto a lot of different people, and including those in the panel. So we have 30 seconds left. Any last words from the panelists? Maybe one final thing that we should do to improve science communication in times of crisis? Anyone want to jump in? It's a tough question to answer in 20 seconds. I think maybe we should leave it there. We'll put you on the spot. But I would like to really, really thank our panel for joining us today, joining us virtually, joining us on the stage. It has been a fantastic and fascinating session, and I think it will be uploaded onto the website afterwards. So if you want to rewatch anything, feel free. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you, Chloe.
Thank you. Thank you.